Welcome to Equus Farm Calls, where we take horse owners along with us to discuss important topics on equine health and care with industry experts. Today, we're talking to Dr. Amy McLean of the University of California, Davis about donkeys and mules. Equus Farm Calls is brought to you in 2022 by Farm, the makers of Weight Builder Equine Weight Supplement. Horses with a high caloric demand can be hard to keep weight on. When your horse needs help maintaining weight, incorporating fat into his diet can safely add calories without the risk of digestive upset. Weight Builder Equine Weight Supplement contains 50% fat with no sugar added to help maintain optimal weight and body condition. One daily scoop provides high-fat calories rich in omega-3 fatty acids to promote a healthy skin and glossy coat and deliver a calming energy for performance. Ideal for performance horses, mature horses, underweight horses, and seniors. I'm Kim Brown, the group publisher of the Equine Health Network. Dr. McLean received her BS in Animal Science with an equine emphasis at the University of Georgia. She received her master's from the University of Georgia and her PhD from Michigan State University. Her research interests include improving equine management, behavior, and welfare, with a specific interest in donkeys, mules, hennies, and working equids in developing countries. Thank you, Dr. McLean, for joining us today on Equus Farm Calls to talk about donkeys and mules.
Well, thank you, Kim, for having me. I'm really delighted to be here and hopefully share some knowledge with donkey and mule owners today.
Well, we know that there's a lot of horse owners that either have gotten or are interested in getting a donkey or a mule or a miniature donkey, whether for a pet or as a sure-footed mount. But horse owners need to be aware that asses are different from horses in behavior and physiology. And Dr. McLean, not only do you study and work with donkeys and mules, but you're an owner. So tell us a little bit about your mule.
Yes, thanks, Kim, for asking about him. His name is Big Star Sarge, and I actually grew up on a donkey and mule farm in Georgia, so I've been around them all of my life. But I still have a mule that I ride and show and compete with. And, you know, it's not like owning a horse. And in California, it's hard to own land. So when I was looking for a boarding facility, you know, I had to tell people up front, hey, I have a mule. They're not quite like a horse. And people assume that they are, but, you know, there's a lot of differences. And to me, one of the most unique things about owning a donkey or a mule, but especially the mules, I feel like they really bond with their owner if they approve of their owner, and they create just an unrecognizable level of trust. And I really appreciate that and enjoy that special bond that I've created with this mule, Big Star Sarge, as well as some other mules. But yeah, I really enjoy having a mule because it also, in my opinion, it pushes you to be a better equestrian, a better athlete, because if you own a mule and you show on the show circuit, which also takes you all around the U.S., there's those we go to back in Tennessee and Oklahoma, Texas, and then we have a great circuit here in California with the American Mule Association. But in a weekend, it's nothing to show in maybe 20 or 30 classes and do everything from working hunter, reining, ranch classes, driving, pleasure, trail with the same mule. And so it really pushes you to be a great rider. And I take lessons with multiple trainers to try to improve my Western events. I picked up cutting this year, which was so much fun. Sarge is 16'3", so he's not exactly what you would think of for a cutting horse or cutting mule. But he grew up in Virginia on a Black Angus ranch, and he actually is very drawn to cattle and did a good job for a big young guy. But that was just something new that we tried and did for our all-around competition. So I just love mules. I really love them. And it's a lot of fun getting to go to some of the places I go on earth and share with owners and veterinarians. You know, mules can also be performance animals, just like a fancy show jumper or fancy quarter horse. My mule can be just as fancy. And I think that in some situations, I think it really helps them increase just the importance of the mules in their own country that are maybe still used in a beast of burden capacity. And that's the only way they've seen mules or thought of mules before.
Yeah, my daughter had a wonderful mare mule that she used to get laughed at, and she's sweet. She brought her little mule. Well, she wasn't a little mule. She was kind of like yours. She was about 16 hands. But she brought her mule to the show, and she would go out and do the different classes. And it'd come time for the little hunter course, and so she'd throw her English saddle. But the thing about mules is they are just so steady. I mean, and she would beat all these English gals, in these little hunter classes. And, then they had a little different respect for Maggie, the mule. I mean, she was amazing. But she also was, she was like yours. She had been raised around cattle. So she was very, cow savvy. And she actually enjoyed it. She thought it was fun pushing something else around for a while. Because, that's one of the things we're going to talk about today is, behavior and temperament and even pecking order. So let's start with behavior, because as I said, asses are different from horses. So tell us a little bit about the temperament and the mindset, because, we hear, mules are stubborn, but that's really not the case.
No, it's really not. People, I feel like oftentimes, they think poorly of mules or donkeys because they're actually very cautious and very smart. And there's been a couple of studies that have looked at their ability to reason. And when a mule stops and they don't do maybe exactly what you're asking them to do, it's because they're taking a moment to go, now, should I do this? And is there a better way to do this? But once you teach them to do something, it really sticks with them, good or bad. So if you don't train them the correct way, or they get away with something, they're going to continue to do that. But I really think their level, or the idea that they're stubborn, is confused with actually a level of caution and their ability to reason and being actually very smart animals.
Yeah, I had a really good friend that has owned and trained mules for decades. And what he said was the best thing about mules is they're not going to let the human get them in trouble. They'll think sometimes better than the human.
Yes, that's right. And I really, I used to go on pack trips in the summer for UC Davis. We had a program in the backcountry with a pack or a group down in Bishop, California. And I always requested a mule. I wasn't about to ride through the Sierra on a horse. And they have some wonderful horses that take guests out, but there's just nothing that beats a mule on a trail, especially a mountainous trail, because they're going to self-preserve, and through that process, they're going to take care of you. And just even the way they negotiate a trail and the way they walk, their movement feels different. And I think, too, that's the reason they've grown in popularity. So much of our equine industry is really focused not on showing or racing, but really in the recreational riding. And people want a safe and trusty trail mount. And there's a reason we see mules in the Grand Canyon and not horses.
Yes. And that is so true. And plus the fact some of the terrain, I ride here in Wyoming, trails a lot, and I've owned horses, and of course I've ridden mules. My daughter has mules, but you'll be going up the trail and you'll be doing all your little switchbacks on your horse, and the mules will literally stop and go, yeah, it looks like a lot of work, and just like cut up the side of the hill and cut off like 4 switchbacks. And it's nothing to them because the footing is fine for them.
Yes. Yep. That goes back to the mule trying to find another way to do things.
Exactly.
And, and some people, I will also say a disclaimer, Tim, for mules and donkeys, they're not for everybody, because some people do not want an animal smarter than them. And I don't mean to offend any viewers or listeners, but that is the case. Our horses, I think, are so easy to mold them into asking them to do things. And, they're just really good partners in that way. But a mule or a donkey, they may not do it. And that's where, again, the stubborn as an ass and the butt of all the jokes comes from. But they're really thinking, should I do this? Is this safe? And for an animal that evolved in the desert like the donkey, their natural instinct is to fight and conserve energy. And a mule being half horse, half donkey, they have some of those similar traits. So you just have to respect their origin, where they evolved from.
Yeah, that the mare mule that my daughter had, she actually, when she first moved to Wyoming, she was a guide up on one of the mountain resorts. She was a dude wrangler, and the wranglers always go out and take the horses and the mules and so forth. And she was allowed to take her own animals up with her, and they came out on a mountain meadow. And the lead wrangler was like, "Come on, let's go across the meadow." And Maggie, the mule, went, "No, I don't think we should do that." And Barbara's like, she thinks we should skirt around this meadow. And of course, the wrangler starts in on the mule, kind of thing. And he's a pretty big cowboy, and he's riding a draft cross, and he takes off there and sinks his horse all the way up to its belly. So, of course, Maggie was great on helping pull him out, because mules are also very strong. So they're great for larger riders and packing and stuff. But yeah, and after that, it was like, if Maggie don't want to go, we don't go.
We don't go. Right. Listen to the mule.
Yeah. And, others that have said that they have had mules keep them out of quicksand before. They go to a river crossing and the mule goes, I don't think so. And so they'll walk them up the river for a little while, and the mule goes, "Okay, we can go across here." Off they go, and then somebody else is like, "Mule," and boop, there they go sinking. You have to go pull them out. So yeah, that's awesome. But there's also, like you said, they're not for everybody, because they are a different kind of critter. So let's talk a little bit about dealing with a mule or a donkey. If you're not familiar with them, how do you go greet one? How do you? There's a reason that mules and donkeys as asses, you have to train them to accept dogs, and some of them never will. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll speak on the dog factor first. So my mule, Sarge, Big Star Sarge, is a saint around my dog. I have a Jack Russell, and so he thinks he's as tall as Sarge, 16 hands tall, in a little dog's body. And he runs under my mule, he throws balls at my mule, and Sarge stands there all day long like he's just part of the family, has never lifted a leg to bother him. When I went to buy Sarge, I had another Jack Russell with me at the time who reached out and tried to bite him on his nose. That was my first introduction to this mule. And his response, he tried to kick us. And that is the normal response of most mules, most donkeys, is to paw, chase after, and kick a dog, especially a dog they don't know. Once they get to know your own dog and even cats, and they're part of you, they're part of the facility or where you're at, then they can be pretty accepting. I have experienced other mules, no matter if it was your dog or not, they were not going to accept them. And that is something you have to watch, especially on a trail. Sometimes people have their dogs on a trail, and I just, you never know if you come across a mule, how it's going to respond. And a lot of donkeys have been used in a guard animal capacity because of that fight nature and to run off, animals that are not from that farm, such as dogs. But even that mentality transfers to people. You'll hear a lot of people, talk about my mule doesn't like a veterinarian. It's hard to find a farrier. And that is true because the donkey and the mule, they associate that person likely with, being uncomfortable or possibly pain. Some mules can be very needle shy. So I always try to, just tell owners, introduce yourself to a mule if you're going to look at one, and same thing with veterinarians and farriers. Walk up and greet them by putting your hand out, start at their head before you go to their neck. I feel like with horses, a lot of times we approach the neck and they're fine with that. But really with a mule or a donkey, and I think the donkeys sometimes come around quicker than the mules do, let them get to know you, and then they will tell you with their body language that you can perceive. I think treats work really well for mules and donkeys in that quick get to know you situation. So My veterinarians, I have a sports medicine vet that comes out and does acupuncture and chiropractic and body work with my mule from UC Davis. And then my local practitioner, both of them, they're so smart. First time they ever met Sarge, they walked up with a treat and they gave him a treat and let him, reach out to them. And, he knows them and he's fine. He is exceptional in terms of he was handled from day one when he was born. So he's had a positive interaction with people. And that also makes a difference, how especially mules are handled when they're born. Dr. Robert Miller, veterinarian, probably a lot of people know for a lot of this behavior work. And a lot of that stemmed from him having mules. And I think veterinarians that work with mules, they're better horse vets because they recognize those slight behavior changes and peculiarities. But really, I think getting to know them and letting the mule kind of be at ease before you proceed with any farrier work, veterinary exam, is a big key. I also think in some cases it's really important for the owner to be present. And the owner may have to help with a procedure. They may have to help with just something as easy as taking the temperature to a mule that's very offensive. And I've worked in other places. We were in Mexico several years ago, and there's a young boy that came in with a big mule, and we all walked up trying to, get some information, and then the mule turns into this wild creature. And it's like, what? And the little boy's maybe 5 years old. It's super calm with him. But they do take a liking and a trust and bond with their people. And we've actually done studies looking at familiar versus unfamiliar people and just recording their reactions of mules specifically and how they respond to somebody in their body language that they don't know.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. And you had talked about, if they were a part of their herd. Let's talk a little about that, because that's one of the ways that even in the wild, these are they handle their society differently, because horses, as we know, they have herds and they wander long distances. But even in the wild, asses are more territorial.
Yeah, that's very true. So we have a study looking at radio collaring donkeys and trying to understand more about their behavior in the wild. But we do know traditionally Jax, the male donkey, will be in charge of an area. They're territorial. And then that's where that fight response comes of another animal, another donkey, a person, maybe a dog coming into that area. They want to fight and run it away. Mules are interesting because they will form a herd because their mom was a horse and horses live in herds. But they will never run that alpha mare mule or molly mule because they're going to follow a horse. That was mom for at least 4, 6, 7 months. And that's also, we haven't really gotten into this, but some people do make the reciprocal cross. They cross a stallion with a jinny and make what's called a henny. And a lot of times, if you're not sure if it's a mule or a henny, the henny you will see hanging with the donkeys because, again, mom was a donkey. So we can learn a lot from their behavior in a social setting. Donkeys really like to have a friend. There's a lot of donkey rescues and sanctuaries out there that will not just adopt out one donkey, just adopt 2 donkeys. And there's something to be said for that. Donkeys are, again, they're probably even more unique and different than the mule is. But, they like their own kind. And in a social setting, a Jenny will have maybe 2 years worth of foals living with her. She'll have a current foal and then a foal that's, or an offspring that's maybe 1 year or 2 years old. So there's small social structures. But donkeys really, they're, in my opinion, similar to elephants and how they bond with one another. So people that do purchase a donkey as a companion for a horse, I think they can form a bond and a friendship. But the donkey, probably if we did an interview with the donkey, they would say, I'd like to have a donkey friend too. Yeah. The horse is okay, but, and growing up, it was really interesting because we had horses, donkeys, mules. We had everything out in a big pasture. And the donkeys stayed together, and the Jennies did. And the horses were clumped together and the mules would kind of go in and out, but the mules were kind of behind the horses. And again, they've done some studies looking at how they socially disperse and who hangs out with who, but a lot of it goes back to who was their mom, and that's who they grew up spending time with. Another thing I will say and mention, going back to mules and how sometimes, as much as I love mules, they're not for everybody. Mules will really bond to a horse, and they may have just met that horse on the trail, but maybe it looked like mom, or they like the color or whatever it is, and they want to hang out with that horse for the rest of the trail. And some mules will show a lot of separation anxiety, such as braying, pawing, leaving, if they're not with their horse friend. And like I said, they can bond pretty quick. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you have a mule, you know how it may bond and what you're going to do when it does bond with a horse friend.
And I've got a miniature donkey, and, you know, she is, when I got her, basically I rescued her from a situation, and she was a yearling, had never been handled, was very sweet, and came to live with the goats and horses and everything else we had. And it was funny, and that was when I lived in Kentucky. You could literally hear the coyotes go around our property. And so they would be attacking other people's dogs and cats and, you know, animals on their farms, and they would not cross foot where that donkey was. It was just amazing.
Yeah, it really is amazing. It's like they know danger, to stay away from the donkey.
Yeah. So you had mentioned that the pecking order and so forth, but let's talk a little bit about bonding with the human, because they like their social circle, mules and donkeys, and they will recognize they're humans. So how do you know, it's not like you can kick them out, and they require, I think, a little more human interaction.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like mules like having a job. My mule just behaves the best when he's being ridden, he's being worked. And I think one reason that's also why he's done really well showing and performing is because he likes his job. He enjoys doing that. And a lot of that is because then he's spending time with me. And, you know, he's being brushed, and there's that interaction. And he lives in a pasture with 2 mares, and he will leave those mares the second he hears my voice, and usually brays, and comes at a walk, sometimes at a trot to me. He knows my car. I can walk in the barn and call his name. He'll bray. So he looks for me. And again, because they do have this higher level of reasoning, I believe, and then just by a couple of studies that have been done, I think they associate some people with very positive interaction.
Yeah.
And again, I think we're all happy maybe when we have a job or we're doing things that we enjoy doing, you know, that brings out happiness in us. And, you know, it's hard to sometimes assign human feelings to animals, but I think there's definitely a lot of signs of contentment when mules are interacting with people they enjoy.
Absolutely. I totally agree. But okay, so we can talk about this as you guys can tell listening to us, we both love mules and donkeys, so we can get a little chatty. But let's go to some of the physical aspects. If you've been a horse owner and you're getting a mule and you've, you know, maybe gone out and tried to learn some things, you know, either from an expert who works with donkeys and mules or whatever, there's still some physical things you're going to have to deal with that are different. And I think I'm going to start with one of the first ones is ears. Everybody's like, oh, look at those great big ears, and they want to go rub them. And not all donkeys and mules, some of them love it. We call it mule loving. But some of them, they would just as soon you not. So how do you help convince people who want to come up and the first thing they want to do is go rub on those big ears?
Yeah, it's kind of like petting a dog they may not know. You don't know if it's going to bite you or not because the dog doesn't know you. And again, I think that's where it's important. You put your hand out, you let the mule approach you, you let the donkey approach you. I see more ear shyness in mules than I do donkeys. But again, by that approach, running your hand up the bridge of their nose, scratching their forehead, then starting to move your way back to the ear. But I think it's just something you have to caution people about, that not all mules like their ears touched. And again, some of that, in my opinion, goes back to how those mules are first handled when they're born. And again, there's different ideas on interacting with foals when they hit the ground, but from a lot of years of experience, and then also experience working with mules that were handled as foals and not, the level of trust, including being able to interact with their ears, is much better in mules that had some stage of early foal handling as soon as they were born and within those few hours. So again, it's just an area we have to caution. And a thing we mentioned talking about was equipment, and how trying to fit equipment like bridles and halters, fly masks, saddles on mules and donkeys is more challenging than horses because of how their body's shaped. But along with their great big ears, their forehead is broader for the donkey and the mule. And there's now on the market quite a few bridles that you can purchase where you don't have to touch their ears, and their ears nicely fit in this nice wide brow band. And then the crown piece actually hooks on the side. So you don't have to smush the ears in the crown piece and brow band. And I think that helps. But again, it's just a caution. And I mean, a mule can even kick you standing at its shoulder, and so can a donkey. So that's something else to be aware of. And that's why it's so important they get to know you before you proceed past the head.
Yeah. And again, some more of the physical things, feet. Now, some mules have feet that look just like horse feet. Most mules don't. And that can be a challenge to some farriers and owners. So let's talk about feet for a minute.
Yeah, so the hoofs of the mule ideally should be a combination of the donkey hoof, which is a very upright hoof, a long heel, a very upright toe. There's even different palmar angles to the coffin bone, the short pasture and the long pasture because of that upright steepness. But that makes sense if you're living in a desert where it's sand. If you have a big flat hoof like a horse, it's going to sink in the sand. So that helps navigate the sand better. The mule will take a hoof somewhere in between a more round, flatter hoof, but then also that very upright hoof of the donkey. A thing I see probably more common, and even my own mule, we're always trying to work against, is not letting the heel run under. So we still need an upright heel, but we don't want the heel to get too low, too flat. Again, those angles should mimic the shoulder angle, the pastern angle. A good farrier, it's anatomy. And look at the anatomy, the conformation of the mule, and then match the hoof to that. But I think in some cases it's kind of scary because their hoof looks so different compared to a horse. Another thing I see a lot of times, some farriers will try to pull the heels together, and we don't want to do that, because if we pull the heels together, then we're going to collapse a wall or a heel on the side. So that's another thing we just have to be cognizant of, is looking at the overall oval of the hoof when we pick it up. Again, those heels are not being pulled together. And then we're also not cutting off too much of the heel and trying to make it flat and more oblong like a horse hoof. There's a few interesting papers out, more so on donkeys and trying to understand donkey hoofs. We have hopefully an upcoming study this fall, winter, looking at biomechanics in donkeys and the loading capacity, which in horses, it's a 3-point system, the toe, then the heels. And donkeys, we think there might actually be 5 points where they're loading, and loading in terms of when there's pressure on the hoof during the gaits, because there's a point where there's pressure or weight-bearing phase, and there's a non-weight-bearing phase. Again, in mules, we're always just kind of hedging our bet, and that's where, again, I try to step in from a professional point and do research. So we go, well, yeah, it's not a donkey, it's not a horse, but they still have their own special needs. So that's just a little kind of advice I have with farriers that are starting to shoe mules. I mean, just look at the conformation, just like you would a horse. Not all horses have the same conformation, so you're not going to trim and shoe all of them the same way. Same thing with the mule. You can do this. So I think that's something important to mention. I just quickly want to mention lameness in mules and donkeys since we're on the hoof subject. Granted, the lameness could run off the leg anywhere, in the limb there. But both are very stoic animals. And oftentimes when they start to show the signs of lameness and the gait is not balanced, the lameness condition is generally more advanced for them to get to that painful state to go, I hurt. So keep that in mind. Abscesses are very common in donkey hooves, especially living in wetter environments. Any listeners in the Southeast now dealing, with the aftermath of a hurricane and all of that wetness, the donkeys are going to be more susceptible to developing abscesses. Again, the abscess a lot of times will not show up until it's more advanced in the donkey. It's much larger. Maybe it's starting to separate the wall. So donkeys also, and some mules, again, on the same hoof topic, seem to be very susceptible to white line disease. So those are just a few things to keep in mind. Laminitis, common in donkeys in all four hooves, not just the front hooves. A lot of times donkeys will actually develop laminitis in the hind hooves before they do the front hooves. So that's a concern. And then things like navicular disease, ring bone, side bone, we also see that in donkeys and mules, probably more in our mules, some of those conditions. So you may hear people say donkeys don't founder or mules don't founder, colic or things like that, but they do. They're not going to tell us until the disease is more advanced. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. And while we're on some of this, talking about weight, because they are desert animals. I mean, they're the original air farm. And I have fought a lifelong battle with this donkey to keep weight off of her. So that's something you have to really keep an eye on.
Yes, trying to manage the weight of donkeys and mules is really challenging. Like you mentioned, Kim, they evolved from a desert. I've done work with donkeys in Death Valley, and they call it Death Valley for a reason. And donkeys thrive there. They look amazing. Their hooves are in perfect condition. Their body weight's perfect. And you go there and it's like, what could they possibly be eating? Where's the water source? So they have evolved to, like you said, survive on nothing, be an air plant. And where we keep most of our donkeys and our mules is with a horse, maybe in a lush green pasture. And the sight of the grass really adds pounds to them. So donkeys a lot of times will get depressed if we do put a grazing muzzle on them. So managing their weight really becomes a balancing act and very difficult. Older donkeys seem to be predisposed to different metabolic conditions. There's been a lot more research in that area, and they've even defined instead of equine metabolic disease, there's donkey metabolic disease, because some of the insulin, ACTH parameters are, again, different, unique for the donkey. We're working on a similar study in mules, so we know what parameters set them up for metabolic disease. But with donkeys, again, I would suggest grazing in the morning. The sugars in the plants are the lowest at that point. Again, limiting grazing. And then trying to add exercise. We want to do everything with diet, but diet needs to be coupled with exercise. Mules, what's interesting with mules, in the beginning, especially a male mule, a gelding mule, horse mule, John mule, we've got lots of different names for the castrated male mule. They tend to be more challenging to keep weight on until they're finished growing. And especially if they're in a performance capacity, if they're being ridden, prepared for shows, or maybe even packed a lot, it might be harder to keep weight on them. So that's just something to keep in mind. And at that point, you can feed feeds like alfalfa. You can feed a higher fat diet. But once they then get to an ideal body weight, and they may be 7 or 8 before they do that, then you need to start cutting back if you are graining them. The grain, consider maybe less hay. Donkeys, we tend to think, can survive on 0.75 to 1% of their body weight. And again, the quality of forage will just depend on the body weight of the donkey. Donkeys programmed to automatically take food that they're eating and store it as a source of fat. Because again, in a desert, it's feast or famine. There's a green period in a desert, believe it or not, and then there's a period where there's hardly any food, and naturally the donkey would break down the fat and use it as an energy source. I also really, really caution people about putting a donkey or a mule on a very extreme diet. That can set them up for a condition called hyperlipemia because you'll mobilize too much of their fat cells at once. So if you're going to dry lot a donkey or even a mule that's gotten obese, slowly make that transition.
That's a good point. And we're running probably a little longer. Of course, again, this is something that Dr. McLean and I love this topic, and all of my mule and donkey friends do. And I know there's a lot of folks really interested in getting mules and donkeys as companions, or just because, I mean, my donkey, it's like your mule. You walk out, she hollers, she'll come across the field. She wants to love on you. She wants you to love on her. I mean, they're wonderful friends to have. But, you know, there's a lot more. So I'll tell you what, if our listeners really want some more information, why don't you send me an email at kbrown@equinenetwork.com, and we'll have Dr. McLean come back on again and maybe cover some more things about mules and donkeys. But for now, Dr. McLean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Kim. It's always great to get to talk about long ears.
Yeah, we love our long ears. And thanks to our audience for listening to Equus Farm Calls, and a special thanks to our sponsor, Farnham. And again, if you have any suggestions or comments for the podcast, you can send an email to me at kbrown, that's the letter K, Brown, @equinenetwork.com. Equus Farm Calls is a production of the Equine Podcast Network, an entity of the Equine Network, LLC.